Well, Paul Simon I played on his tribute show, and then he played on my tribute show in New York at the Radio City Hall place. And then after I got to talk to him a little bit, and then he called me about a week after the tribute show was over, and he asked me if I'd like to. He asked my manager if I would like to do a tour with him, like Bob Dylan did last year with him. And so they told me, I said, absolutely, I'd be thrilled to death to do it.
Even Brian, isolated somewhere between the studio and his sandbox, must have been aware that society was changing. Young people in America and around the world were becoming more confident about questioning the priorities of society. Drugs, sex, race and the Vietnam War became key issues in a generational divide, and public figures, even pop musicians, were increasingly asked to take sides. Artists such as the Beatles, the Stones and Dylan, to a greater or lesser extent, identified with the counter-culture. Musicians such as Elvis Presley, who had seemed revolutionary only a decade before, had more conservative instincts, and they suddenly seemed to be old-fashioned. The Beach Boys were in an odd situation. Their new music was being hailed as groundbreaking by key opinion formers in the music business, but their image still owed more to the conservative middle-class values of Murray Wilson and his Hawthorne neighbourhood. While the band's members were arguing over whether they should be following Brian's vision or going back to jolly songs about surfboards instead, they seemed to have missed the fashion train. The first Beach Boy to consciously reach out to the counterculture was, oddly, Carl, the quietest and more modest member of the band. Thousands of young Americans were being drafted into the war in Vietnam, a conflict that seemed to many to be both immoral and unwinnable. In January 1967, Carl joined an increasing number of young men who refused to serve. It was a risky move. The heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali had also refused the draft and was now looking at the possibility of a 5-year prison sentence, as well as a lifetime ban from his sport. But Carl's decision did raise the Beach Boys' standing among the peace and love generation. In April, they were asked to close the Saturday night lineup at the Monterey Pop Festival, scheduled for June. The festival was a huge success. The lineup was a mixture of folk rockers such as the Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel and the Mamas and the Papas. Stars of the British invasion such as The Who and the Animals, soul heroes like Otis Redding and Lou Rawls, and up-and-coming rockers including Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin. But the Beach Boys weren't there. The band's motivation for backing out of their Monterey commitments has never been defined to anyone's satisfaction. One potential problem was that for such a high-profile event, Brian would be expected to appear, and his stage fright combined with his frustration and depression over his failure to finish Smile made the prospect terrifying. The fact that the Beatles had released their magnum opus, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, only a few weeks before, can only have added to his plummeting confidence. The most probable explanation is that the band collectively felt that they would be out of place among the pot-smoking, flower-wearing advocates of love, peace and letting it all hang out. Their withdrawal confirmed the general perception that they were conservative squares, out of step with the counterculture. In the words of Bruce Johnson, the Beach Boys were seen as surfing Doris Days. In July, the band released a new version of a song that had been intended for Smile. Heroes and Villains was seen by many as a weak retread of Good Vibrations and failed to make the top 10. It was included by Smiley Smile, an odd album that consisted mainly of songs and fragments from the Smile sessions, patched together by the band. It was the first studio album in a couple of years that could rightfully be called a Beach Boys record, rather than a Brian Wilson record. As such, it signalled the intention of the other band members to wrest control from Brian and restore their commercial fortunes. It didn't succeed. America was entranced by Sgt. Pepper, and Smiley Smile failed even to reach the top 40. As Brian, with his meticulous standards, was sidelined, the Beach Boys returned to their former breakneck work rate, releasing Wild Honey in December, just 4 months after Smiley Smile. It was marginally more successful, hitting number 24, but it was clear that the band's back-to-basics approach had not encouraged the fans to return. By this stage, it was apparent that the various band members were getting bored with being Beach Boys. Carl was managing the career of a South African band called Flame, and Brian had invested in a health food store called, and how 60s is this, the Radiant Radish. At the same time, Mike Love was becoming increasingly interested in transcendental meditation and joined the Beatles, Donovan and others at a retreat in Rishikesh, India, with the movement's guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Love claimed that what sold him on the Maharishi's teachings was his mantra that you don't have to give up your Rolls-Royce and forsake all your pursuits of material pleasures to develop inner spiritual qualities. Dennis, meanwhile, had become acquainted with an oddball called Charles Manson, letting him stay at his house in Sunset Boulevard, and even getting the frustrated songwriter some studio time. Manson even wrote a song, Never Learn Not to Love, that ended up as an obscure Beach Boys B-side at the end of 1968. Eventually, Dennis grew tired of his new friend and evicted him, an act for which Manson swore revenge. Dennis thought little of it until Manson's so-called family, a strange crew of misfits who followed his creed of apocalyptic racism, murdered 7 people over 2 nights in 1969, then appealed to the Beach Boy for help. When Dennis refused, Manson threatened to kill him, but was soon arrested and is serving a life sentence to this day. Despite the distractions, the Beach Boys were still recording. Their late 60s album could be quite good. For example, 2020 contained the hits Do It Again, I Can Hear Music and Cotton Fields. But a more representative sign of their deteriorating relationship with Capitol Records was the 1968 compilation Stack of Tracks, essentially some old hits with the vocals removed so that listeners could sing along. While the company can be congratulated for forecasting the rise of karaoke, it also demonstrated that they were desperate to squeeze anything they could out of the Beach Boys' legacy. As the 1960s ended, so did the Beach Boys' contract with Capitol. There was doubtless relief on both sides, but the end of 1969 had a nasty shock waiting for Brian. His father, Murray, who still had ownership of all his son's songs, sold the copyrights for $700,000.
I love to produce. Yeah, I do. I love it. I like to produce myself on a Phil Spector tribute album. That's just one idea.
1970 didn't begin much better for the Beach Boys. They had a new deal with Warner Brothers, although records went out on their own brother label. Unfortunately, this change of record company didn't have a beneficial effect on their record sales. In the early part of the 1970s, there was a string of singles that failed to chart and albums that sold only to true devotees. The Sunflower album, originally called Add Some Music, reached a pathetic number 151 in 1970. Part of the problem was Brian's increasing detachment from the group. His drug intake was increasing and his mental state was a cause for concern. He'd also apparently given up his interest in health foods and his weight was ballooning in an alarming manner. He would sit for hours in his sandbox or roam the streets in a bathrobe, sometimes asking for small change like an overweight bum. To fill the void, the other Beach Boys all chipped in their songwriting efforts, although these only served to show what fans were missing. Typical monstrosities included Bruce Johnson's horrible accordion-tinged Tears in the Morning on Sunflower and the eco-hippie platitudes of Don't Go Near the Water, credited to Mike Love and Al Jardine, from Surf's Up. The Junior Wilson brothers had a few good ideas, but they paled in comparison with Brian's work. As Dennis put it, Brian Wilson is the Beach Boys. So what could they do when their genius leader was unwilling or unable to do what he did best? Well, there were still some outstanding songs left over from the Smile sessions, including the heartrending track that gave Surf's Up its title. Despite Brian's protest, these were reworked and used to plug the gaps in what had become a decidedly leaky boat. The band members tried many things to revitalise the Beach Boys. Carl brought in Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar, his protégés from the band Flame, to provide some fresh blood. Other auxiliary members included James William Garcio, who had previously worked with Chicago and Blood, Sweat and Tears, and Daryl Dragon, later to be half of the pop-rock duo The Captain and Tennille. They even spent several months living in the Netherlands in 1972 because they found the laid-back atmosphere conducive to their working methods, and shipped their studio over to Europe piece by piece. The resulting album, inevitably called Holland, did modestly well upon release the following year, peaking at number 36. It seemed that the Beach Boys remained pretty insignificant as a contemporary recording act, but they remained a big draw on the live circuit. Although they had lost a lot of credibility by bailing out from the Monterey Festival, they were achieving respectability within the rock elite. The likes of Elton John and Keith Moon of The Who performed with them. The Grateful Dead, one of the seminal bands of the hippie counterculture, pronounced themselves to be fans and joined them for a freewheeling jam session. They even appeared at anti-Vietnam War benefits. Their live show played to packed houses throughout the world. It seemed as if Mike and Al's instincts were right. The fans didn't want heartfelt epics about pillaging the environment, and certainly not weird lyrics about dominoes. They wanted the hits.
Yeah, okay. I would say that the expectation rate was so high that it was a disappointment to some people to see that we were not continuing in the rock and roll kind of fashion.
Capitol still held the distribution rights to the Beach Boys catalogue up to 1969, and being sensible business people, they intended to make the most from their property. In June 1974, they put together 21 Beach Boys classics, most of them pre-Pet Sounds cuts, and packaged them as a compilation. America was facing the traumas of the Watergate scandal, which forced President Nixon to resign, the ignominious exit from Vietnam, rising oil prices and inflation. The Beach Boys' early work seemed to sing about an earlier, happier, sunnier, more innocent world, where kids drank root beer rather than taking acid. The music struck some kind of collective chord. The Endless Summer album soared to the top of the charts, and this success spurred Warners into investing more in the slumbering giant they had on their books. Brian was persuaded to return to the studio with the rest of the band. Brian Wilson now weighed about 300 pounds and lived in a permanent state of distraction and paranoia. His mental health had taken a further hit in 1973 when his father died of a heart attack. All Brian's confusion, ambivalent feelings rose to the surface, and neither Brian nor Dennis attended the funeral. Murray was, by all accounts, a difficult man who had physically abused Brian and sold his son's songs to make some quick cash. As Mike Love sarcastically said a few years later, "I didn't resent Murray any more than I'd resent anyone who stole from his kids, beat them unnecessarily, intimidated them, and screwed them up emotionally." But he was still Brian's father, and Brian felt he owed him some kind of loyalty. Brian's fragility meant that the sessions were a painstaking affair. They began in Colorado before moving to California, but nobody seemed happy with the results. A fire in the Colorado studio later destroyed most of the tapes, and it was back to square one. In the absence of new music, Capitol and Warners each released another greatest hits album to soak up any spare cash. In fact, so dependent was the Beach Boys' success on their back catalogue that in 1974 Rolling Stone had voted them Band of the Year, entirely on the basis of the Endless Summer compilation and their nostalgic live shows. In 1976, when the Beach Boys finally released a new studio album, it met with the biggest commercial success their new material had seen for a decade. But 15 Big Ones wasn't exactly packed with new Wilson compositions, despite a massive publicity campaign based around the slogan, "Brian's Back." Instead, the album was full of cover versions, mainly of songs from the 50s and early 60s. Even some of the so-called originals were fairly tired. Susie Cincinnati was an Al Jardine track from 1969, and Had to Phone You, probably the best track, was based on Trombone Dixie, an unreleased song from the Pet Sounds sessions. 15 Big Ones made the top 10, despite its relative thinness and its frankly stupid title. The band continued to be a major live performance with a concert in New York Central Park in 1977, attracting a crowd of 150,000 people, most of whom were screaming for California Girls and Surfin' USA, rather than any of the new material. But this return to the commercial mainstream did not necessarily mean that all was well in the Beach Boys universe.